Sleepless in Ephesus, on the demons of habit and their taming through first theory. The cure for extravagance, discourse analysis. Ludwig Binswanger was probably the only psychiatrist who Foucault knew understood, not to say predicted him, in the sense that he found in Binswanger's writings the most important elements for a language of endangered life, both in general and in his own particular case. In those writings he became acquainted with the tragic interpretation of verticality, in which the extravagance of existence means being stuck too high up on the existential ladder. It was also clearly from Binswanger that he adopted the reference to Henrik Ibsen's play The Master Builder, premiered in 1892. It portrays a manic architect who builds higher than he can climb and ultimately falls to his death from the unlivable height of his tower. Most of all, Foucault owed to Binswanger his early insights into the basic problem of his own existence, which the Heidegger-inspired psychiatrist had summarized in space analytical terms as a disproportion between width and height, or discourse and flight. This imbalance can, as Binswanger explained in his 1949 essay Extravagance, manifest itself either as a manic volatility and rapid digression through ideas in the vols imaginaires, or as a schizoid scaling of heights that do not stand in any positive relation to the narrowness of the experiential horizon. In this sense, extravagance is the disease of the talented youth. The therapy consists of a form of mountain rescue intervention. The aim is to bring the lost climber back to the valley and explain the terrain to them until they feel able to respect the circumstances on their next climb. Understanding those circumstances involves knowing the relation between the difficulty of the slope and the training level of the peak conqueror. Existence analytical therapeutics is thus more an ethics than a form of medicine. It offers guidance in proportion-aware behaviour within the existential space. This space is existentially structured insofar as verticality and horizontality here have an ethical, not a geometric meaning. Hence the horizontal stands for experience and discursivity. Possibly this is where Foucault drew the idea of discourse analysis as an acquisition of the ability to navigate in the horizontal space, and the vertical for height of rank and decisiveness, assuming that existential height implies the ability to make decisions. This brings into view an ethics that does not have values, norms, or imperatives at its centre, but rather elementary orientations in the field of existence. In the orientation ethical approach to the how, the whither, and the wherefore of existence, it is assumed that the subjects, the existing parties as those able and unable to live their lives, are always already immersed in a field or milieu that provides them with basic neighbourhoods, moods and tensions in certain directions. That is why ethics is the theory of the first disclosedness and movedness, and thus first science. The first things are not givens, but rather aspects of tendencies between extremes, complications, facilitations, narrowings, widenings, inclinations, disinclinations, lowerings, raisings. They form, in the matrix of the moods, Stimmungen, that Heidegger disclosed for philosophy, a complex of pre-logical insights and orientations which the logical, concrete, and evaluating world relations are hooked into. The first ethical distinction in Heraclitus. The earliest reference in the old European space to a mode of thought that formulates an ethics of the kind touched on above can be found in a collection of fragments attributed to the Ionian proto-philosopher Heraclitus, who lived at the turn from the 6th to the 5th century BC. I am thinking in particular of the equally well-known and enigmatic fragment 119, quoted by Stobias. Ethos anthropo daimon, conventionally translated as man's character is his fate. Heidegger famously expressed his dissatisfaction with this trivial translation in the letter on humanism addressed to Jean Beaufort in 1946. He accuses it of being thought in modern, not Greek, terms, an objection that still applies to the slightly modified Swabian-tinged version, man's particularity is his demon. In order to shift things into place, Heidegger feels it necessary to bring out the heavy, fundamental ontological artillery. He treats the seemingly unassuming terms ethos and daimon like funds deposited in an idea historical bank that, even with the lowest possible interest rate, have now, over 2,000 years later, grown into an enormous fortune. In his view, only fundamental ontology is entitled to make withdrawals from this ancient meaning account, for it alone is capable of thinking pre-Socratically and post-metaphysically all at once. I will now show how, as exaggerated as his suggestion may be, he was not entirely wrong. Heidegger's cunning. In order to gain access to the treasure of meaning, Heidegger uses a hermeneutical trick. He brings the ethos daimon statement together with the anecdote, related by Aristotle, in which Heraclitus, the philosopher from Ephesus in Asia Minor, is visited by a group of hesitant strangers who find him warming himself by the oven and bids them enter with the words, "Here too the gods are present." The contextualizing strategy is as simple as it is effective. Just as the oven anecdote is meant to remind us that even in the ordinary, the unusual shines through, that the divine is present even in the most unassuming. The fragment to be interpreted seeks to express that the unknown is present in the known, and the supra-real in the everyday. Hence the saying, if one translates ethos with stay or abode, which is problematic, and daimon with God, which is probably a little too lofty, would mean man dwells, insofar as he is man, in the nearness of God. Although I consider this first translation by Heidegger unsuccessful, both philologically and philosophically, it has a stimulating element, for living in the nearness of God means discovering a form of vertical neighbourhood, in which it is even more important to find a modus vivendi with the resident of the apartment above than with one's next-door neighbour. One can work with this point, even if the rest is unconvincing. But that is not the end of it. Heidegger then makes a second translation suggestion, in which he turns the problematic into the grotesque, by augmenting the motif of neighbourhood with that of uncanniness. Now the three little words, ethos, anthropo, daimon, supposedly mean the familiar abode is for man the open region, for the presencing of God, the unfamiliar one. If that were truly the meaning of this statement, it would make Heraclitus the most profound commentator on Heidegger's work ever to come from ancient Greece. Nonetheless, Heidegger did understand one aspect of Heraclitus's epigram correctly. The word ethos, which should probably be taken in a more down-to-earth sense and translated somewhat less precociously as behaviour or habit, is placed in a state of upward tension through its combination with the word daimon. Here, instead of thinking of the God, it is sufficient to imagine some higher spirit force that could tend equally towards good or evil. Nor does this power simply border externally on the human ethos complex, for it is capable of overpowering it from within and sucking it up. What the daimon brings about, the ethical distinction. If one leaves aside the curious aspects of Heidegger's consideration of Heraclitus, something remains that is more than a mere projection. Every complex of human behaviour contains a certain tension between height and depth. It consists, if the image is permissible, in an ontological two-story structure that is explicitly noted from now on, insofar as one can equate noting with describing. It entails that the lower, the habitual foundation, and the upper, the demonic, are capable of absorbing each other. In both directions, one should note. First, if a bad ethos pulls man cacodaimonically downwards until he keeps the swine company, as Heraclitus tirelessly asserts in a series of drastic animal comparisons, the language game man equals swine evidently runs through from Heraclitus's Ephesus to Wittgenstein's Vienna. Or, secondly, if a good ethos lifts him up agathodaimonically, so that he approaches the sphere of the divine, theion. This corresponds to the saying of Heraclitus, quoted by Celsus, fragment 78, which states that ordinary human behaviour, ethos anthropeion, has no valid insights, nomos, whereas that of the gods, theion, does. No talk, then, of the familiar human abode transcending towards the unfamiliar of its own accord. Heraclitus's opinion is more along these lines. As long as man remains in his average ethos, he has nothing that connects him to the realm above. If it were true that fragment 119 implicitly adopts any stance concerning the place or abode of humans, it would be this. Where we are, the animal confinement of the many to their habits collides with the openness of the few to the logos. This is completely in keeping with the tendency of numerous other statements attributed to Heraclitus, which leave no doubt as to how he, whom tradition portrays as a melancholic, and eo ipso, a man of distance, judged the forms of life among the masses. That this quote-unquote misanthropic thinker should have stated that man, as such, in his habitual circumstances, should be open to the divine, as Heidegger suggests, is quite simply unthinkable. Nonetheless, Heidegger was right to note a fundamental problematics of verticality in Heraclitus's use of the word ethos. This does not concern the alleged transcendence of man towards the divine, regardless of whether one calls it the superego, the super-tu, or the super-id. Heraclitus was an ethicist, not an anthropologist. His first ethics deals with a difference among humans that first becomes explicit through thought, or perhaps one should call it becoming aware of the logos dimension. Heraclitus's misanthropy is the fanfare that opens the explication. It shows how the difference within each human manifests itself as a difference between humans. If Heraclitus places the many and the few in stark opposition to each other, it is not because his thought is elitist, but rather because he is among the first of those who became specifically aware of the thought that has always been acting unnoticed within us, and who thus actualized the difference between the thinking, or more precisely those attentive to the logos, and the others, the inattentive ones in the first place. He could not have done this if he had not first established within himself the predominance of thought over non-thought, or rather of having good sense, sophronein, which fragment 112 thus terms the greatest virtue, arete majesti. It is precisely from this gesture, the subordination of non-good sense to good sense, that ethics comes about as first theory. Consequently, ethics can only take the form of a duel between man and himself, though this duel can be externalized as a provocation of those who evade it. From its first word, the first ethics already deals with the difference between that which is above and that which is below, yet usually strives to reach the top. This ethics as a primary orientation has an immediate ontological sense, provided it contains the thesis, sophronein exists. It would be a theoreticistic reduction of this statement, however, if it were used to express no more than its propositional content. It is an authoritative, spurring, and tonic statement that confronts its addressees with the challenge, give precedence to sophronein. The oldest version of the metanoetic imperative already demands that humans distinguish between the upper and the lower within themselves. Being superior to oneself. That the prime ethical directive, you must change your life, becomes acute in the pre-Socratic word sophronein, and with a manifestly practiced theoretical tendency, can be explained with reference to a thought formulated by Plato 100 years after Heraclitus in a greatly admired passage from Book 4 of the Republic, dealing with prudence, sophrosyne, in the individual and in the polis. There, prudence is defined first of all as dominance over the desires, epithymion epikrateia, though I cannot say at this point what these epithymic feelings known as desires are, or what is meant by quote-unquote dominance. Then Socrates draws our attention to the peculiarity of the self-relationship to which he refers. If prudence is related or identical to dominance over affects or passions, it manifests an inner asymmetry within humans, a dramatic difference from themselves that can be evaded but not neutralized. This is demonstrated by the figure of speech that someone is stronger than themselves, kreato hauto, which is also translated as superior to oneself. At first glance, Socrates says, such a phrase seems ridiculous, and paradoxical to boot, for the man who is master of himself will also, I presume, be the slave of himself, and the slave will be the master, as both statements are made by the same person. In reality, the laughable expression is a symptom of the most serious matter. In man himself, in auto to anthropo, there is evidently a better and a worse side relating to the soul, peri ten psychen. This matter, which is no laughing one, emerges in actu in twofold fashion, in the reflections formulated here and in the life conditions they address. If the part that is by nature, physei, better rules over the worse part, one calls this being stronger than oneself, or superiority over oneself, and rightly praises it. If the situation is inverted, however, and the worse part, which is also the larger, overpowers the better, which is naturally smaller, one speaks of being weaker than, or inferior to oneself, and rebukes it accordingly. The further applications of these reflections result from the maxim of all political psychology. As in the psyche, so in the polis. Two aspects are decisive for an understanding of this philosophy historically fateful passage. Firstly, Plato here manages to integrate the affect of contempt, which appears in a crudely external way in Heraclitus, into the structure of the psyche, so that contempt becomes a regulative principle of the person and an agent of their self-direction. Whoever is able to feel self-contempt has already mastered the decisive aspect. Secondly, Socrates clarifies why the worse part can only take over after bad education, whose criterion lies in leaving untethered a koloston, something that requires tethering, and, if all were as it should be, could be tethered with ease. If one assumes that for the Greeks, paideia was an amalgamation of insight and training, or differently put, the result of intellectual instruction and physical drill, then the talk of the imminent takeover by the bad side unmistakably contains the call for more training, or a lament about the failure of the current scheme. Naturally, one could, in the style of the sociologizations, still customary today, raise the objection that Plato's talk of self-superiority was a projection of Greek class structures onto the psyche. Then one could, in the mode of the utopianism that is no longer so common, add that in a classless society, the self-relation of the psyche would be rebuilt into flat hierarchies, or even complete anarchies without any above-below difference to speak of. These objections, however, miss the essence of paideia. The idea of restraint comes from an internalization of the differences between teacher and pupil, or trainer and athlete, possibly also between rider and horse, which have nothing to do with dominance in the usual sense. The relationship between the aristocracy and the rabble only provides a metaphor for these conditions, and to take it literally would be to misunderstand the autonomous laws of figurative speech. In truth, a manifestation of verticality emerges in paideia that cannot be depicted by, let alone reduced to, political dominance. That does not, of course, mean that the matter is automatically understood by its carriers, namely the operators and patients of training. The basic confusion of Greek ethics, as well as the art of education connected to it, comes from the fact that it never managed to work out the difference between passions and habits with the necessary clarity, which is why it also never clearly articulated the corresponding difference between dominance and practice. The consequences are evident in over 2 millennia of ambiguity in European pedagogy. Initially, it often suffocated its pupils with authoritarian discipline by treating them as subjects, while later on it increasingly addressed them as false adults and released them from all discipline and practicing tension. The fact that pupils are initially and mostly burgeoning athletes, not to say acrobats, who must be brought into shape, was because of the moralistic and political mystification of pedagogy, never pointed out as explicitly as a matter of such import would require. For the time being, nothing seems simpler than the thought that existing passions, destructive intensities or obsessions, demand restraining, that is, dominance, while habits are not given a priori, but rather be built up in longer periods of training and practice. They grow through mimetic repetitive behaviour, but turn into a will-supported autonomous effort at a certain point in their development. As elementary as the distinction between habits and passions may seem, however, the association of these two factors has led to the most diverse confusions throughout the history of ethical thought. One could go so far as to say that, along with the asceticisms themselves, the ambiguities in the understanding of ascesis constitute the broadest and longest fact that exists on the ascetic planet. In Europe, asceticisms and their misunderstandings are of more or less equal age. The incomparably more deeply thought-out universe of the Indian asanas simultaneously shows us that this long-lasting confusion is a regional fate, not a universal law. Once this has been grasped, one understands why the emancipation of practice from the compulsive structures of old European asceticism, as I hinted at the start, may possibly constitute the most important intellectual historical and body historical event of the 20th century. Between two overpowerings, the possessed human. If we go back from Plato's reference to the vertical distinction within humans themselves to Heraclitus's aphorism, it is illuminating how the thinker of Ephesus treats the same problem with a logic that is still entirely elementary, almost destitute. Now one sees clearly how this archaic three-word wonder, ethos anthropo daimon, itself formally demonstrates what it is talking about. The word man stands in the middle between the two all too easily confused ethical factors, habits on the left and passions on the right. Whatever other meanings ethos can have, it unmistakably refers here to that which is habitual, moral, and conventional, while the word daimon indicates the higher power, the overpowering and supra-habitual force. If one accepts these semantic deliberations, serving the illumination of the two opaque terms, two new ways of translating Heraclitus's phrase arise. The first would be, among humans, bad habits are the overpowering force. The second is, new good habits in humans can gain control over the most intense passions. Naturally, we cannot say which of these Heraclitus had in mind. His logic was archaic, insofar as the archaic is the condensed embodiment of the not yet differentiated, the pre-confused, while the confused re-entangles alternatives that have already been unfolded. The pre-confused contains not yet unfolded alternatives, intertwined, contractor. Here there are even fewer words than thoughts that need to be expressed. It therefore remains unsaid or folded in whether the demonic manifests itself in the form of bad habits or noble passions. It need hardly be explained why the prestige of the pre-Socratics reached its zenith at the start of the 20th century. Never had the homesickness of the European intelligentsia for the pre-confused beginnings been so strong. At the same time, this homesickness was never exposed to a stronger temptation to increase confusion by seeking refuge in unsuitable simplifications. The original ethical confusion in European philosophy manifests itself in two complementary and time-honoured eras that run through the history of reflections on the question of how humans should live. In the first, the restraining of passions is confused with the exorcism of base demons, and in the second, the overcoming of bad habits is confused with illumination through higher spirits. The Stoic and Gnostic movements, with their striving for apathy or speedy escape to the world above, are representative of the former, and the Platonic and mystical traditions, with their inclination to kill off the flesh or pass over embodied existence, of the latter. That these attractive eras did not become the mainstream is due to the resistance of the pragmatic ethical strict systems, which were aided by the anonymous wisdom of everyday cultures. Both are sources drawn upon by the legacy of European knowledge about the art of living, as demonstrated most recently by Michel Foucault's late studies. The anti-extremist projects of Aristotelian, Epicurean and skeptic provenance mostly achieved a fruitful balance between vertical passion, that is to say the restraining of desires, and the horizontal effort, namely the imitation and cultivation of good habits. They surveyed the difficult terrain in which the two primary directions of movement, the spreadings and the ascents, make their demands. If one reads the ethos daimon statement directly alongside Socrates' words about the restraining of passions, one understands better the path on which old European thought found itself confronted with what was termed possession in religious contexts. In its older usage, the word daimon reminds us that being human and being possessed were initially practically the same. Whoever has no daimon has no soul that accompanies, augments, and moves them. And whoever lacks such a soul does not exist. They are merely a walking corpse, or, at best, an anthropomorphic plant. If one now places the term ethos and daimon so closely together that anthropo is directly between them, one sees how the human being is fundamentally bound between two forms of possession. Possessed by habits and inertias, it appears under-animated and mechanized. Possessed by passions and ideas, it is over-animated and manically overloaded. The form and degree of its animation are thus entirely dependent on the mode and tone of its possession, and on the integration of the occupier into its own self. The majority of people throughout history have only acknowledged the latter, the psychistic or passionate side of possession, as apparent in ancient notions of accompanying demons, invasive demons, personal geniuses, and evil spirits in a wealth of images. It observes with concern its negative, de-animation, dispiritedness, depression. The early philosophers, on the other hand, the first gurus and educators, increasingly concentrate, in the morning light of their art, on the second front, the habit creature side of the human condition. One could speak here of the habitual or hexic forms of possession, from Latin habitus, habit, and Greek hexis, possession, inner property, habit. It represents possession by a non-spirit, a taking over of humans by the embodied mechanism. paideia, gripping the roots of habit. To understand how humanity's dual possession was brought to an end by the ethical ascetic Enlightenment, one must consider that the history of anthropological and pedagogical thought in Europe was, in the long run, identical to a progressive secularization of the psyche. That is, identical to the conversion of the logic of possession into programs of discipline. In the course of these programs, possessions of the first type are reformulated as enthusiasms and sorted into advantages. Recall Plato's list of the 4 good forms of enthusiasm or madness in the Phaedrus, and harmful ones. Among the latter, wrath, thirst for fame, and greed stand out. In Christian times, these were included among the 7 deadly sins. As they are no longer official forms of possession, only their functional successors, they are no longer driven out through exorcism, but rather tamed through discipline, using the crudest of methods if need be. The statements of Aurelius Augustinus, 900 years after Heraclitus, can be placed in this progressing line. In his text, On True Religion, he calls on Christians to become men by subduing, subjugare, the woman in themselves, these blandishments and troubles of desire, a task that faces women in analogous fashion, because they should likewise be man enough in Christ to subjugate the womanly desires, feminaeus voluptates, in themselves. Here Augustine still clings firmly to the schema of the Platonic psychagogics of affect. Dominate that which would otherwise dominate us. Gain possession of that which would otherwise possess us. Because he embeds it in a theology of the devil, the tendency towards a re-demonization of the passions always remains present. It is palpable here how the repressive understanding of asceticism as a dictatorship over the inner nature begins its triumphal march through the Christian centuries. As far as the second type of possession, habit, is concerned, its secularization leads to the concept of self-education, which includes a discrete self-exorcism. The human being owned by its habits must succeed in reversing the conditions of ownership and taking control of that which has it by having it itself. This applies above all to the bad habits that are to be replaced by good ones. Thus, Thomas à Kempis, still fully in the tradition of the first educators, writes, "Habit overcomes habit." In the more radical spiritual practice systems, the demand for a breaking of habitual conditionings is still being expanded to the neutral, even good habits. For example, in the theatre pedagogy of Konstantin Stanislavski, or the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, founded in October 1922 in Fontainebleau by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. From the perspective of the radicals, the habitus basis of human existence is, as a whole, no more than a spiritually worthless puppet theatre into which a free ego soul must be implanted after the fact, and through the greatest effort. If this fails, one experiences an effect in most people that is familiar for many athletes and models. They make a promising visual impression, but if one knocks, no one is at home. According to these doctrines, the adept can only rid themselves of their baggage by subjecting their life to a rigorous practice regime, by which they can de-automatize their behaviour in all important dimensions. At the same time, they must re-automatize their newly learned behaviour so that what they want to be or represent becomes second nature. Thinking and wakefulness. For Heraclitus, the dark, early, preconfused one, such differentiations and complications are non-existent. In his thought, the passions and habits could stay together in a single class, contained in the dimension of vagueness termed ethos anthropaion, human behaviour, in fragment 119. On the other side are the suprahuman factors, the divine, the fire of reason, the immeasurable psyche, and the all-pervading logos. Compared to them, one reads, even the wisest human is a mere ape. One cannot speak of any paideia. one cannot yet speak of any paideia, but there is a statement by Heraclitus, fragment 116, quoted by Stobios, that heralds the 2,500-year empire of the educators as if in mockery. It tells us that essentially all people, including the uninformed masses, are capable of knowing themselves and having good sense. Heraclitus enjoys an even greater privilege in being permitted, on the intellectual side of his doctrines, to leave together what would have been taken apart in a latter culture of rationality, and even spread among different disciplines. Being awake, having good sense, and listening for the Logos. Later generations and more distant periods assigned waking, alongside the phenomena of sleep and dream, to psychology and the security services, while good sense was handed over to practical philosophy and ethics, and a receptiveness to the Logos to logic, mathematics, and structural theories. If there is one strong characteristic of the pre-Socratics, assuming they are not simply an invention of modern compilers, for which there are indications, it seems to me that it lies in the pathos-filled equation of waking and thinking. If one had to say in one sentence what constituted thought in the Ionic era, the answer would be, thinking means being sleepless in Ephesus, sacrificing one's nights in Miletus. One can almost take this literally, as the proximity of the Ionians to the Chaldean traditions of nocturnal celestial observation may also have bred in them a tendency towards intellectual night work. The contempt of the waking for the sleeping belongs to the basic inventory of intellectual athleticism. As Heraclitus's fragments tell us, the distinction between diurnal and nocturnal activity is meaningless for waking thought. The waking that is unified with thinking performs the only asceticism that can help the first philosophy get into shape. As waking thought, it is pure discipline, and acrobatics of sleeplessness. If it does not virtually unify the thinker with the ever-wakeful Logos, it certainly brings them close together. It is no coincidence that some of Heraclitus's harshest words deal with the dependence of ordinary people on sleep. For him, hoi polloi are none other than the people who do not awaken to the shared koinon in the morning, but instead remain in their private world, their dreamy idiocy, as if they had some special knowledge. Idian phronesin. These are the same people who also sleep through religious matters, as it were. They think they are purifying themselves by soiling themselves with blood, just as if one who had stepped into the mud were to wash his feet in mud. Trapped in their own worlds, people do not hear what the non-sleepers have to say to them. If one speaks to them of the all-pervading Logos, they merely shrug their shoulders. They see nothing of the One, even though they are submerged in it. They act as if they were seeking God, yet He is standing in front of them. Thinking without waking, waking without thinking. East-west contrasts. Among 20th century thinkers, it was Heidegger who first thought to regain the privileges of pre-confused, contract symbolic thought through his secession from the 2,500-year philosophical tradition. In this way he attempted, in opposition to his own time, yet keeping up with it in some respects, to restore philosophical activity to its pre-Socratic state, when a unity of waking and thinking had temporarily been possible. The decline of pre-confused unity had already proved inexorable 2,500 years ago. The rapid progress in the formation of concepts split the basic terms of old into many partial meanings. Not all words survived this development intact. The archaic verb sophronion, in particular, to be of good sense, the most elegant term of achievement in the ancient world, lost its penetrating energy and intimate appellative effect when it congealed into the noun sophrosyne, which refers to the virtue of prudence among a group of other virtues. However, Heidegger's interpretation of this process, the freezing of verbs into nouns, and the move from event observation to conceptual concoction, as the fate incurred by forgetfulness of being, Seinsvergessenheit, contains an unacceptable exaggeration that contributes little to overcoming the problematic situation it touches upon. The asymmetrical decay products of this process led to the far-reaching differences between the culture of rationality, or ethics, in the Occident and the Orient. While the Western path, generally speaking, saw the establishment of thinking without waking, devoted to the ideal of science, the Eastern path arrived more at a waking without science, which strove for illuminations without conceptual precision, based on a state store of wisdom figures that more or less belonged to all masters. Heidegger's attempt to circumvent the opposition of scientism and illuminism from a neo-pre-Socratic angle produced a concept of thought that is clearly closer to meditative waking than to the construction or deconstruction of discourses. His late pastoral of being, which is closer to an exercise than a discursive praxis, points to the undertaking of transforming the philosophy of consciousness, after a shake-up of its passage through existential philosophy, into a worldly philosophy of wakefulness. It is fair to assume that man, as the guardian of being, is subject to a sleeping ban. It does not become entirely clear in Heidegger's work, however, how the timetable for guarding being is planned. Nor is it easy to see how the guardians receive the night work permit in the laboratories of elite research. The bet is as plausible as it is demanding. It is now a matter of carrying out the transformation of thought into a wakefulness exercise envisaged by Heidegger, without regressing below the level of the modern culture of rationality. Whether Heidegger himself achieved this is doubtful for a number of reasons. His later doctrine became too much of an idyll amid the monstrous. Reader's note, idle as in idyllic here. Before Heidegger, it was only Oswald Spengler who presented a few provisional, but not insignificant sketches for a critique of the rationalist access to the world via a general theory of wakefulness. Instead of pursuing this, however, he translated it into a speculative psychology of advanced civilizations, and thus philosophically neutralized it. Furthermore, he distorted his subtle references to the fear-based constitution of wakeful existence, which resurfaced 10 years later in Heidegger's inaugural address, What is Metaphysics, of 1929, through the crudeness of his pragmatic faith in the precedence of quote-unquote facts. Taken as a whole, the philosophy of the 20th century fails somewhat pitifully in the face of the imperative of a culture of wakefulness. It is not without reason that it lost the majority of its virtual clientele to the psychotherapeutic subcultures in which new, livable stylizations of the relationship between wakefulness and knowledge had developed, not infrequently to the disapproval of those employed as civil servants to look after theory. Against the background of theosophical amalgams of traditions from Eastern and Platonic sources, Jiddu Krishnamurti, 1895 to 1986, developed the most radical doctrine of wakefulness presented in the 20th century. Distancing himself from his earlier indoctrinations, he declared that it is always possible to exit the construct of the rational world from one moment to the next and burn all notions in the flame of attention. For reasons that are not entirely clear, Krishnamurti refused to examine the connection between the capacity for constant wakefulness in the moment and working on oneself through practice, or the cathartic clarification of the psyche in detail, and to integrate the possible results of such studies into his theory. Even though his own history of clarification is among the most dramatic and well-documented examples in the history of spiritual exercises. After Heidegger, it was above all Foucault who took up the bet, and proved in his work how waking and thinking can once more be convincingly connected in a contemporary existential intellectual project. From the circle of German thinkers who followed on from Heidegger and went to the limits of what was currently possible, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker is the most notable. It was he who probably came closest to the paradoxical ideal of a pre-Socratism at the level of contemporary knowledge. His late central work, Zeit und Wissen, Time and Knowledge, possibly the most profound scientific philosophical book of the late 20th century, was ignored by the public and colleagues alike, by those not of the opinion that they were amusing themselves to death.